And if you're just joining us, we'll start momentarily. We're just waiting for a crucial amount of us to come in. If you're already here, welcome. We are so glad to have you this evening. All right, we'll go ahead and dive in as folks continue to join us. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia with Politics in Prose. We're live with author Peter Staley and Garance Franke-Ruta discussing Never Silent, Act Up, and My Life in Activism. We'll put a link in the chat so you can purchase the book directly from us at Politics in Prose. If you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature you see at the bottom of your taskbar. We'll move to questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time for all of them. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of the screen. And we do want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We are very grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and spirits afloat. It's now my pleasure to introduce this amazing memoir and these speakers. Author Peter Staley, renowned strategist and activist, organized some of ACT UP's most spectacular actions, from shutting down trading on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange to putting a giant condom over the house of Senator Jesse Helms. His memoir, Never Silent, right here again, is the inside story of what brought Staley to ACT UP and the explosive and sometimes painful years to follow. Years filled with triumph, humiliation, joy, loss, and persistence. Peter Staley has been a longtime AIDS and gay rights activist, first as a member of ACT UP New York, then as the founding director of TAG, the Treatment Action Group. He was a 2016 fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics and is a leading subject in the Oscar-nominated documentary, How to Survive a Plague. More recently, Staley co-founded the Prep for All collaboration and the COVID-19 Working Group, New York. And Garance Franke-Ruta is an NYC-based writer and editor who most recently served as executive editor at Medium's Gen magazine. She spent 2 decades in DC, where she served as editor of Yahoo News and editor-in-chief of Yahoo Politics, Voices columnist and politics editor of The Atlantic, national web politics editor for The Washington Post, senior editor at the American Prospect, and senior writer at the Washington City Paper, DC's alternative weekly newspaper. She's currently working on a memoir about coming of age in New York City during the height of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and early 1990s. So keep a lookout for that one. But for now, on behalf of Politics in Prose, please join me in welcoming author Peter Staley and Garance Franke-Ruta. Thank you both for being here. I'll turn the stage to you.
Thank you so much for having us here tonight. Peter, I'm so excited to be diving into this book with you. It was thrilling for me to read these tales of daring do for people just tuning in who don't know the backstory. So Peter and I first met 32 years ago when I was part of ACT UP and a fellow member of the Treatment and Data Committee, and later a member of the Treatment Action Group in the late 80s and 90s, which is to say before I went to college. And one of the things I loved about this book, though, was that there's just so much about your life I didn't know, especially, the period between like the 90s and 2012 when we sort of lost touch a bit and then got back in touch through David France's How to Survive a Plague movie. And it was great to see these stories also of older gossip and newer insider stories in the book. So, Peter, I want to ask you a question tonight to start us off with, which is, where are you zooming in from?
This is a little weird. We had to squeeze this in because after this got scheduled, most of the AIDS activists I know are now, including myself, are doing COVID activism. So once again, we are pestering the Tony Faucis of the world. And we had scheduled a dinner at his house for tonight that ends the minute that this broadcast ends. It starts the minute this broadcast ends. So I asked Tony if I could come over to his house beforehand, and so this is Tony Fauci's office. I'm unblurring for a second.
Yeah, you turned the blur off.
Yeah. So this is his office. I think.
So this is Tony Fauci's office in
Back
his
there.
house,
Back there. Oh, there's the national shirt he was wearing.
where apparently he does not have a ring light. So that's an interesting little factoid.
Well, I'm gonna blur it again to give the guy a break.
Yeah, he's got
let me
enough
set up
public
here,
exposure.
and I'll go straight from here to getting very angry at him about the progress of international COVID vaccines with the Biden administration.
So before we talk about Tony and your lifetime knowledge of Tony, dating back to when you were, I think, 25 or 26 years old, you were going to read a section about when you were much younger, the time you shut down trading on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in a bid to get the pharmaceutical company Prose Bookstore to reduce the price of AZT, the first AIDS drug that was approved as an antiviral for HIV, and one that at launch was the most expensive medicine ever brought to market, costing $10,000 a year at the time, which I don't even know how much that is in today's dollars, but the answer is just a lot.
Right. So yeah, let me read from this chapter. This is about a demonstration that shut down trading on the New York Stock Exchange. We had negotiated with Burroughs Wellcome. They didn't lower the price just because we asked them to. So we started a series of demonstrations against them in 1989. And it was only 2 years after I had, or actually a year after I had left my job on Wall Street. I found out I was HIV positive when I was a closeted bond trader at Morgan Guarantee, who had their offices directly across the street from the New York Stock Exchange. And I had to listen for 5 years to extraordinary levels of homophobia, sexism, racism on the bond trading floor. I heard the F word, faggot, almost 20 times a day, and really had to just sit there and take it all and stew about it. So here we go. I got little sleep the night before the demo. This was becoming typical for actions I planned. The mind would race endlessly, playing out various scenarios. There were always a few weak spots during deployment when a little bit of bad luck could bring the action to a screeching halt, and no amount of strategizing could eliminate these vulnerabilities. You just had to roll the dice. At 8 a.m. on Thursday, September 14, 9 members of ACT UP sat nervously around 2 tables at a McDonald's on Nassau Street, about 5 blocks north of the exchange. As we downed our coffees and Egg McMuffins, we ran through the game plan a few more times, making sure everyone's questions were answered. Hold on. And roles defined. 7 of us would be going inside. 5 of the 7 would stage the disruption in the balcony. Me, Greg Bordowitz, James McGrath, Lee Arsenal, and Scott Robbie. The other 2, Robert Hilferty and Richard Elovich, would hang back on the exchange floor and attempt to take pictures of our disruption. The 2 additional members of our crew would provide logistical support outside. We couldn't count on there being any press in the room, and giving the press a heads up was out of the question, since they'd have to arrange access with the exchange. We'd have to be our own press, not an easy thing in a time before iPhones. Hilferty and Elovich had small disposable cameras with high-speed film that could take a decent picture inside a building without a flash. Still, taking those pictures while surrounded by dozens of pissed-off traders would be dangerous work, even without the flash. It was our hope that everyone's eyes would be looking up toward the balcony, leaving our photographers in peace. The 5 of us who hoped to climb those balcony stairs had dressed carefully that morning. We were loaded down with hidden gear strapped to our bellies beneath the button-down shirts, jackets, and ties that fleshed out our corporate cosplay, much like the padding a drag queen would attentively prepare before her show. There was a large banner carefully folded down to a thick square, and 8 feet of steel chain, a padlock, handcuffs, and extra goodies that would spice up the show. We appeared to be slightly pudgy stock traders, at least on the way in. My wristwatch was accurately set so that I could see the minutes and seconds count down to the opening bell at 9:30 a.m. We left the McDonald's around 9:05 for the walk down Nassau Street toward the corner of Broad and Wall Streets, then mingled near the tourists under George Washington's statue in front of Federal Hall, watching the traders smoking cigarettes in front of the exchange. The last cluster of traders started making their way onto the floor around 9:27 a.m., and we merged up against them from behind as they each held the door open for the next guy. We had decided in advance it was probably better to acknowledge the guard with at least a grin of recognition, however false, but avoided any vocal greetings. It was the one choke point moment where everything could go wrong. We had to look like we belonged there while our hearts were racing. I should just back up and say we had fake IDs that made it look like we were traitors. I passed the guard first. Our eyes locked for a split second while I curled a grin, then looked forward toward the backs of the traders we were following. The guard glanced down at my badge. None of us broke our stride, keeping pace with the real traders who did this every morning just before the opening bell. I resisted looking back at my comrades until safely out of view of the guard. We regrouped on the edge of one of the most foreign and frenetic environments these boys had ever seen. All of us were in. We had less than 2 minutes to find our places and prepare our show. Ready? I asked. Everyone nodded. Robert and Richard started walking onto the floor, looking for good camera sight lines of the balcony from 2 different angles. The other 4 followed me to the old wooden staircase. My first steps up felt victorious. From this point, there was little chance anything or anyone could stop us from doing what we came to do. As the 5 of us reached the top of the stairs, we crawled on all 4s to the balustrade, hoping not to be spotted before the opening bell. We untucked our shirts and emptied our pockets as we gathered our protest contraband. Next, we looped the chain over the top rail and padlocked its 2 ends together, forming a long loop. 5 steel handcuffs were used to lock each of us onto the chain. The banner was unfolded and stretched between us, still out of sight. I looked at my watch. It was 9:29 and 15 seconds, 45 seconds until the opening bell. We each pulled out one more item from our coat pockets, our guarantee for maximum impact that would stop everything else on the trading floor and announce our enemy incursion with a bang. Our thumbs were on the triggers of 5 pocket-sized air horns with their warning labels saying, "Do not use near ears." At 9:29 and 45 seconds, I said, "Ready?" and then go. We stood up and lifted the black 8-foot banner over the balustrade. It had a simple 2-word warning that could clearly be read from the far corners of the trading floor. Sell welcome, a reference to the company that had ignored our warnings. Each of us had an arm raised high in an amplified power salute. Our air horn blasts became a what the fuck moment for the hundreds of traders below. No one heard the opening bell. For the first few seconds, it seemed like the trading floor was frozen. Traders stopped walking and talking. Everything stopped while our horns became a piercing new reality. As all heads turned our way, they soon put 2 and 2 together. They read the banner and knew that over 1,000 AIDS activists would be protesting just outside later that morning. Yet somehow, inconceivably, we'd invaded their turf. They exploded in anger. The traders surged toward the balcony. Many of them pointed at us, yelling for security guards. Before our horns died out, Greg Bordowitz and Lee Arsenault had one more surprise in their pockets. In homage to Abby Hoffman, they threw fistfuls of fake $100 bills onto the mob below. Many of the traders noticed something printed on the backs of the bills. They picked them up and grabbed them midair and read the provocation. "Fuck your profiteering. People are dying while you play business." At this point, they were rabid. As security guards made their way toward the balcony, traitors started throwing wads of paper at us, yelling, "Mace the faggots!" I looked for Robert and Richard, but they had quickly taken pictures during the first seconds of the disruption and had exited the exchange as planned. One of our support team outside ran the cameras up to the Midtown offices of the Associated Press, which promptly developed the film and found one usable picture, perfectly angled to capture the stock exchange's logo on a banner hanging behind us. The AP quickly ran the picture with a story on its newswire. In any other circumstance, a large crowd of angry heterosexual men yelling "faggots" with their fists raised would fill me with justifiable fear. But after years of hearing this word used almost daily at my job on a bond trading floor, and years of suppressing my closeted rage and feeling the sting of powerlessness against hate, this moment became the most cathartic of my life. The faggots had the power now, and the haters were merely our pawns. The redder their faces got and the more they cursed, the bigger my smile grew. Nothing they could do now would diminish our success. The action would likely get front page coverage in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Their hatred would only feed the public sympathy for our cause. 3 security guards finally climbed to our balcony and tried to pull us away, only to find that we were locked to the balustrade. One of them yelled into his walkie-talkie, "We need a bolt cutter." A scuffle broke out below us. I saw Robert running toward the exit with a half-dozen traitors chasing him, yelling, "Get that faggot!" After he and Richard had exited the exchange to hand off their cameras, they foolishly came back inside to see if we were okay. Some of the traitors were scouring the floor for possible collaborators and had pounced on both of them. Richard's jacket was pulled off in the scuffle, and then a shirt sleeve was ripped from his shoulder. Fortunately, additional security guards intervened, and both of them were whisked off the floor. The crowd below us continued to jeer as we waited for the bolt cutter. Every time a traitor yelled a slur at us, I looked right at him and widened my smile. This made them angrier. The bolt cutter arrived, and a burly guard made quick work of our lightweight chain. With one guard assigned to each of us, we were escorted down the stairs toward the angry mob that I'd been relentlessly taunting. After witnessing the roughing up that Robert and Richard had received, the security team realized they had a logistical problem of getting us from point A to point B, from the balcony past hundreds of traitors to the elevator banks just off the floor, and finally to their security office on one of the upper floors. This was already a deeply embarrassing news event for the exchange. Any violence, especially against a person with AIDS, would only make things worse. They smartly decided to protect us. With all the manpower they could muster, a human chain of security guards and exchange personnel had been deployed, stretching from the bottom of the stairwell along the east wall of the trading floor to a corridor that led to the elevators. They needed every man. The traitors pushed against them, trying to grab us, spinning into us, and throwing more wads of paper at our heads. It was like a Hollywood scene in a medieval fortress, where the captured bronze invaders are marched to the dungeon through a mob of bloodthirsty villagers. But in our film, the righteous invaders were eventually rescued by their own army and welcomed back as conquering heroes. We made it unharmed to the elevators. The guards took us to a small office on an upper floor where one wall was filled with live feeds from various security cameras. We joined Robert and Richard around a rectangular folding table where I imagine the guards ate most of their meals. "What are you guys doing here?" I asked. I joked to Robert and Richard. "We thought they were going to kill you guys, so we came back in," said Robert. Turning serious, I asked about the cameras, whispering, "Did you make the handoff?" "Yes," he quietly replied. "Were you both able to get some shots?" I asked. "We think so," he said. All of us were smiling from the sheer relief of having pulled off our mission impossible. The guards looked distraught as they quietly discussed their next steps and who would carry them out. An executive type, probably the head of the security, approached us, and started the interrogation. He was holding Richard's fake badge and asked, "Where did you get these?" "We had them made," I said, still smiling. "Where?" he asked. "A place that could make them," I answered. "Okay, guys, we're going to need the rest of those badges," he demanded. "Sure," I said, and removed mine, leading my comrades to do the same. Badges in hand, our interrogator apparently didn't need to know more and said, "Hang tight, guys." We waited and then waited some more. Finally, a New York City police officer came forward and told us they'd be driving us to a local precinct for processing. "There's a situation outside, so sit tight while we work on getting you out of here," he said. We knew what the situation outside was. Hundreds of AIDS activists were beginning to arrive for the lunchtime demonstration, and our support team was spreading the news about our preemptive strike. We waited some more. Eventually, a bunch of cops squeezed into the room, one for each of us. They handcuffed us together like a chain gang, then led us to the elevators. Once the doors opened, we began the most exhilarating perp walk any of us had experienced in our combined histories of arrests. The NYPD not only wanted to protect us from revenge-minded stock traders we passed in the building, they also wanted to prevent any mingling between us and the crowd of press and activists outside. We were greeted by a tunnel of blue, about 50 cops forming two lines on either side of the elevator that led all the way to the police van, just like the waiting camera crews and photographers, just past the waiting camera crews and photographers on the sidewalk. You'd think we'd committed the crime of the century to warrant such handling. As we exited the exchange, we all raised our fists in victory while gathered activists chanted, "Act up, fight back, fight AIDS," as the cameras clicked. Years later, I saw a film clip of our perp walk. It zoomed in on Robert Hilferty and me as we were about to get into the police van. For a brief second, I looked up. Across the street, the bond trading floor I had worked on just 2 years earlier was directly above me now on the 6th floor of JP Morgan's headquarters. I had looked down on the exchange's iconic columns for the 4 years I had worked there, 4 years in my stifling closet, smiling at homophobic jokes, telling 1,000 lies, and fighting the inevitable depression from living alone with my secrets. And now, my former colleagues were pressed up against those 6th floor windows, wanting to see the disruptors of the opening bell. They would read about us on the front page of the Wall Street Journal the next day, and on the front page of the New York Times the day after that. And they would read another front page story in the Times 5 days later titled, "AIDS Drugs Maker Cuts Price by 20%. Before entering the van, I let them have a good look. I was exactly where I was meant to be, with my people, proudly and openly fighting for our lives. With that quick look up, the circle was now closed and the pain erased.
Thank you, Peter. I love that recounting of the story of that action, which happened before I joined ACT UP later in about a month later, actually, in 1988. You've told me this book is an episodic memoir, and I read it as a tale of, swashbuckling daring do from the active years to the present, which is more of an action memoir than a coming of age story or something exploring relationship of two characters, you and your family, a particular time in your life, since this covers from when you were young to really this past year. Why do you think we're seeing so many AIDS memoirs and histories right now? You talk in the book about something you call the second silence. I'd love you to talk a bit about that and what you think people are doing right now, writing all these stories down.
Yeah, I first heard about this phrase, the second silence, in the AIDS crisis from a young, a millennial AIDS activist in London, Dan Glass, who founded ACT UP, founded a renewed ACT UP London in 2012, 2013. And this was the first silence, obviously, was the Reagan administration and the American public ignoring the first years of the AIDS crisis and letting thousands of gay men die and letting the epidemic get out of control and spread both domestically and internationally. And this second silence was after we got this big breakthrough of triple drug regimens that turned the disease from a death sentence into something manageable. This happened in 1996 after ACT UP worked very, very hard for 10 years fighting various administrations to get that research done. The gay community kind of turned its back on HIV/AIDS. It pivoted to gays in the military and then gay marriage. I mean, those were great issues to tackle. I have nothing against them, but the pivot was very absolute. They basically, I think because of the pain that they had gone through with the AIDS crisis, they just wanted to stop thinking about it. And even from an activist perspective, they abandoned AIDS and all of us as survivors. So it was a very painful pivot, a painful period. And I think it started to get broken in 2012 with David France's documentary coming out. And there were other documentaries that came out around the same time. And that started a period of reflection of what had happened in the 80s and 90s. That I'm happy to say hasn't really slowed down yet. So for almost 10 years now, we've seen various projects, including major network television series like Pose, really reflect back and look at some of ACT UP's actions and incorporate those into their own narrative.
I know it's very strange seeing things you did turned into fictional things that other people are doing.
Exactly. So,
and I think that Ryan Murphy actually acknowledged you in the credits as a thank you in one of the episodes of Pose that I watched.
Right. So it's a good thing, and there's so many more stories to tell, and I really hope this momentum gets maintained and those stories find a home and a platform.
Yes, and one of the other questions, since we did mention that you were in Tony Fauci's house right now, for those who joined late, Peter is zooming in from Tony's, I want to turn to the question of Tony, because he has had a very long tenure in public life, and this is also not his first pandemic. It's not even his second pandemic. He was a central figure in the work of ACT UP, by turns an ally and an opponent and adversary. He played an unwitting, starring role in many of the divisions that fractured relationships in the group. And he was someone who you had a lot of work with when TAG was working in the early Clinton years to advocate around reorganizing how the National Institutes of Health funded and studied AIDS medications. And now you have an ongoing relationship with him from the COVID pandemic. So you have this lifetime of work with him in these different roles. And I want you to just talk about them and what is the latest one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure I met him as an ACT UP member in 1989. And our first target had been the FDA in late 88. That was kind of ACT UP's national coming out, a demonstration where the public noticed that we were the movement du jour. And as it turned out, Fauci, who was running research effort at the NIH and also taking care of patients at the NIH hospital, had his own frustrations with the FDA. So there was this kind of coming together of, there was some synergy there. And we started meeting with him, and he gave us some hefty lifts of endorsing our critiques of the FDA and some of the especially a big reform of the FDA that we advocated for called parallel track, which allowed access to AIDS drugs while they were in phase 3 clinical trials. Everyone else could get the drug as well before approval. And he endorsed that. And so our first 6 months were very cooperative, and we started meeting with him regularly. It should be noted that he was one of the only government officials that just willingly opened his office door to ACT UP as soon as we asked for meetings. Most government officials were scared to death of us. They thought we were crazy, and to his credit, maybe because we were New Yorkers and he considered himself Brooklyn tough, he thought he could handle us and debate us, and I think we impressed him right from the get-go of how we had done our homework and really had a lot to bring to the table. And that started a dialogue that often was combative. After we pivoted from the FDA to what he was doing at the NIH, it got quite combative. We thought he was running the AIDS clinical trials group inadequately is a nice word to put it. There was a great deal of room for improvement, and we started pressing him on all those issues, and it ended up demonstrating at the NIH a huge demonstration in front of his
And you had this big smoke sticks.
They were smoke grenades, Israeli surplus smoke grenades, military surplus. So we put on this very
on top of another building, I think.
Yeah.
If I recall correctly.
And but it was very obvious to me that while we thought he had his administrative faults, that he was fighting AIDS for the same reason we were, that he really cared. I never doubted that. And that started a kind of a love-hate relationship that turned into a friendship over the years. So when COVID hit in January, February 2020, and all of a sudden he's in the White House press room at the podium with the orange monster. We were, all his AIDS friends, me included, were like, "Oh my God, poor Tony, how is he handling all this?" And we didn't want to overwhelm. We were already jumping into COVID activism ourselves, and we didn't want to overwhelm him immediately with lots of demands. But we were worried about the guy, and I would text him and just right after one of the press conferences and say, "How you holding up?" And he would surprise me by saying, I'll call you right back. And then once he'd get in the car on the way home, he'd call, and he really wanted to vent. He really wanted to, say what was going on. And the basis of our relationship over 30 years, the thing that I find very beautiful about it is that I've always been able to tell him to his face what I think his faults are, what I think he's doing wrong, and he has never pushed me away. And I've been doing this relentlessly for 30 years, and
he's still there.
And he pulls me closer. And I had lots of problems with him during 2020, so I spent half the year loving him and advising him on how to survive the Trump White House.
I just what did you tell him about how to survive the Trump White House? I'm fascinated by this.
Well, he was in an interesting political situation where there were two camps in the White House. He did have one camp of insiders who were at least initially in his corner. And then he had a camp that was nervous about him, and eventually that nervous crowd turned into actual haters. And we're talking about the Peter Navarros, etc. And it was like a chess game of how to use the players in that camp to stay in the game. But there were also moments where I was pushing him in the summer of 2020 to resign from not ever resign from NIAID or the NIH, but to resign from the task force, because it was obvious at one point after April, after the closures ended, it was pretty obvious that the task force was being completely sidelined and ignored. And so there was a real debate to be had about why stay, especially if it put him in situations where he'd again have to be at a podium where Trump was spewing racist rhetoric like the China virus, etc. So we had those discussions and had those debates, and it was, as I say in my book, before I was an activist, I dreamed of being a politician. I ended up being kind of a politician activist. And I had big dreams. I was going to go to the House and Senate, and who knows what after that, You always dream of the biggest office of all. And if I couldn't be a president, my second favorite dream was being a presidential advisor. And I ended up, I never got that. But in 2020 and 2021, I've been, or the first weeks of 2021, I was the advisor to the president's nemesis. And that's pretty cool. That's really, really cool. And guess who survived? Guess who was at his desk January 21, 2021? It wasn't the Orange Monster. It was Tony Fauci. He's a great survivor, and I'm really proud of the guy.
One of the things that is so, there's just all these wonderful little details in the book about how people did activism back in the day. And it's something that two people in the Q&A have asked about as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because there's a number of different scenes where you gain access to a place where you're doing a civil disobedience action. And I should say as well, like, ACTIV was explicitly, formally, organizationally nonviolent. People were trained in civil disobedience, assigned things from Martin Luther King and Gandhi during civil disobedience trainings and so on. But like, you just walk in someplace because the security is not very great. There's a world of laminated badges, and there's no digital turnstiles, and digital recording for the most part of actions that people undertook. So can you talk a little bit about how activism was different before the internet and what that made possible, and what it made, just how things are now?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly much easier. Most, as people remember, people our age and older remember New York in the 80s, a lot of the office buildings, and you can still find office buildings like this in New York, a lot of the office buildings had maybe one guy at the security desk. But if you walked in and act like you work there, you're not stopped, and you can go into the upper floor. And so when we hit, companies within a big office building that only were on one floor, for instance, we could just walk in most cases.
Right, and you would find the person who you were trying to protest against by looking up in the phone book.
Yes, exactly.
And then finding a name, and then going there, and then walking asking them.
Once we set up and invaded their lobby and handcuffed ourselves in, I'd go back down the elevator, past the security guard, where all the media would be waiting for me. The television cameras that I told to meet me at this building. And then I bring them in, and I tell the security guard, we're having a press conference at Cohen Pharmaceuticals. I was acting like I worked at Cohen. And so I'm bringing these camera crews up. And so I bring the press past security. So it was stuff like that. And the stock exchange, you could never do what we did. And how lax it had been. There was
and the action.
one security guard and
Also,
no metal detectors. Unbelievable. They spent $10 million to upgrade security after our action, rightly so.
wow. And the action at Jesse Helms's house as well, where we put a giant inflatable condom
You and
in
I,
editor's house. Yes, I was part of that as well. And you know, and then the only consequence of that was that we got a parking ticket for the truck, the U-Haul truck being parked the wrong way
right?
on the street because he
Yeah,
didn't want to press charges. Uh,
yeah, yeah. We got. Oh, that I kind of predicted that he wasn't gonna be dumb enough to press charges and let us have our day in court, which we really would have enjoyed, because that would obviously give us another entire news cycle after putting a condom over his house. It should be noted that we did this when he was in North Carolina, and
yes, it was scheduled for the summer recess when it was
we
known
knew the
that
house was empty, and we didn't want to cause any heart attacks or have any violence with anybody.
and then when you did do the action at Burroughs Welcome, when you went down in the press release and in, I guess, reserve, you said this was another action against the pharmaceutical firm Burroughs Welcome, that ACT UP would cover any of the damages,
Right.
which allowed you guys to get off with lower charges because you, in fact, did pay the damages that you
Yeah.
created to the property.
Yeah, this was actually, it was a tricky action because it was the first, it wasn't definitely upping the ante uh, as far as civil disobedience, even for ACT UP, because we had never done an action that built into the action was very costly property damage. And we were worried that the press would portray us as terrorists. They used the T word because we were intending to go in and basically wreck in order to seal ourselves in an office, that office would have a lot of damage. And so we put in our press release that we'd pay for our property damage. That the property damage was a side effect of our action, but we weren't there, we weren't trying to hurt the company by we'd fix it. And that was I have never actually, I've asked Greenpeace and some other movements if anybody had ever done that. Any other activist movement had ever said, we're going to cause property damage, but we're going to pay for it. And I think it was a first, and it worked. We got really sympathetic press. So should
we've
we
been
take
talking
some
quite
questions?
Yeah, I do want to ask one more thing though first, which
Yeah.
is we've been talking a bunch about the outside game, and there's been a lot of debate in the historicizing of ACT UP and the broader AIDS activist movement about the inside-outside game. And could you just talk a little bit about where T&D and TAG fell on the spectrum of inside and outside? Because what you're describing is a lot of outside protests, which
Right.
were inspired by T&D.
Yeah. And I think this is, Sarah Schulman's book, Let the Record Show, came out earlier this year. And she has some really brilliant insights into what made ACT UP such an extraordinarily effective movement, including its use of inside-outside game. But I do think a difference in her and my perspective is that she has tended to portray T&D as kind of siloed as the insider. This is the Treatment and Data Committee of ACT UP, the committee within ACT UP that really pushed for drugs into bodies, to get the AIDS research done, to find the drugs that might save our lives. And that's not my memory at all. T&D actually perfected the combination of inside outside. A lot of ACT UP's biggest demonstrations, most well-known demonstrations, came out of T&D. The FDA action, the NIH action, shutting down the New York Stock Exchange, all the pharmaceutical company actions. Those all came out of T&D. We were doing brilliant outside work. and at the same time that we were doing inside work. And so we weren't just a bunch of insiders. We were doing the 1-2 punch better than anybody's ever done it. And it is a fair critique, though, I think, of after the split happened 5 years into ACT UP, a lot of the members of T&D formed TAG, the Treatment Action Group. And while we did some demonstrations in our first year, we eventually focused almost exclusively on our inside game. But I explained that in the book this way for a couple reasons. First off, the outside game was beginning to lose its punch. We were getting more and more creative. ACT UP was trying to get maintain the attention of America's mainstream media, and they had seen 4 or 5 years of AIDS demonstrations on a weekly basis. The number of demonstrations ACT UP generated was extraordinary. We were the movement du jour, and we just kept cranking them out. And by year 5, we were yesterday's news. Some of our most creative actions, you see this in one of the most powerful demonstrations in American history in the film How to Survive a Plague, where we threw the ashes of our loved ones over the fence onto the lawn of the White House with police horses swarming in from either side, and everyone crying while they're doing it. It's just an extraordinary moment. That got totally ignored by the press when we did it. It's only later in these films that people are seeing some of the most powerful activism that we were doing. But if you're ignoring, it's like a tree falling in the woods with nobody there. Did it make a sound? And we weren't making an impact with the outside game anymore, no matter how creative we were. At the same time, our inside game was getting better and better and better. We had gained the confidence of the scientific establishment and creating partnerships with factions within the medical scientific establishment to actually move the entire research effort in certain directions. So why wouldn't you double down on that and keep working on that harder and harder? So that's what TAG did.
Yeah. Well, speaking of inside game, I would like to take some questions. One of them is about a very inside game, which is whether or not you'd still be interested in running for office. I have also been wondering this because I know you have an apartment in the West Village in addition to the time that you spent in Pennsylvania, and that the representative from the West Village, there's some talk about whether or not he might be not running again.
Absolutely not.
Too many videos out there.
Not in a million years. No, I'm still a very busy activist. I love activism. I'm doing tons of COVID activism, and I will in 12 minutes we'll be making some COVID activism history in Tony's dining room with a bunch of people, and I'm not allowed to say who. And no, I love what I'm doing now, and obviously the state of politics in this country is a disaster and becoming increasingly depressing. I still follow it closely. I still have political heroes, lots of them, and we'll need more. But I'm 60, about to turn 61, and just want to keep the activism rolling.
Okay. Let me go to some of the other questions here. From Colleen Murphy, you and other AIDS activists have spoken about how the COVID-19 pandemic triggers the trauma you harbor from the early years of the AIDS crisis. What have you learned about managing that trauma now that you wish you had known in the early 1980s?
Yeah, it was very triggering at first, especially because, how crazy was it that the next big killer pandemic in the US and worldwide since AIDS happened again during the watch of a president who got it wrong, and for somewhat different reasons. Both Reagan and especially Trump were anti-science. Reagan to a much smaller degree, but he definitely had some. He wasn't a fan of the scientific community, and his base did not want him to do anything that acknowledged the gay community. So that kept him from reacting at all to the AIDS crisis. And Trump's base largely drove his response eventually to COVID, and we all paid a horrible price for it. One of the first deaths in COVID was Terrence McNally, and so a great gay playwright who's written beautiful plays that have various AIDS themes in them. He managed to get through the entire AIDS crisis staying HIV negative, and went on to create great art. And then right away, COVID got him, and it was like, oh my God, we're going to start going to all these funerals again. It's just going to be one after the other. We're all going to know people. So it was very triggering on that second emotional level as well. And at least for all of this, we had the experience of before, and we felt more emotionally capable of been there, done that. I'd hate to say it, but a little more ready, and we could move immediately into action. There was no lack of self-confidence. I mean, we didn't know at the beginning of ACT UP. We knew we'd make history, but we didn't know whether we'd rack up any victories, because America just despised us at that point. We were up against just huge forces against us. Now we know we have a great deal of confidence in our ability to get things done. There's no doubts that we can win some battles, and we have during COVID, and we plan to try to get the ball further up the hill tonight as well.
Another question from anonymous attendee. Do you think people who live through the AIDS crisis are more sympathetic towards those who, for whatever reason, haven't been vaccinated against COVID-19 and have been hospitalized with worse cases? The quote, "serves them right" rhetoric is very unsettling.
Yeah, it is unsettling, and I think most AIDS activists have tried to avoid it. We really, one of the great, I think probably the greatest standout characteristic of AIDS activism is that we embraced science, and it took us. We had to get on a learning curve. We didn't have all our ducks in a row right at the beginning, but pretty quickly by year 2, we had fully embraced science. We knew that we had to push it, get it going faster, but that science was the only thing that was going to save us. And that attention to becoming our own experts and embracing the greatness of the history of public health, which does not finger wag or scold. It just takes the world as it is, and it says, how can we save lives? That's the beauty of public health. That's the beauty of the attitudes of people like Anthony Fauci, is they take whatever's thrown at them by the world, whatever the reality is, and they just keep going. They say, how do we take this situation and save lives? Stepping on a platform and starting to scold people is nothing but ego and self-involvement and making yourself feel better. It does nothing for public health. And so we don't have any time for that.
Another question, was it difficult to revisit some of the weaknesses or mistakes in your activism? How did you get through those years?
Sure. At least for the first 3 years of ACT UP, I think we were really good at being a movement that analyzed stuff as we were doing it and did postmortems on what we were doing. It's very dangerous. I've seen this happen with, I saw it happen with ACT UP later on, and I've seen it happen with other movements where you really become you have a moment of where you're the center of the world, everybody's watching you, you think you can, and then you get the power goes to your head and you think you can do no wrong. And that self-reflection begins to wane. And I think that's when movements can make mistakes. And as I point out in my memoir, there was a moment that I think led to the split where a faction within ACT UP came very close to making what would have been the largest mistake in the history of AIDS activism. And another faction in ACT UP fought back, prevented that mistake from happening. But that battle between those two factions split the group apart, just ripped it apart, and we had to split off. So it's hard, but definitely activists can make mistakes, and those mistakes can cost lives. So if you're involved in any activism, do your postmortems and constantly debate internally. Do not shut down debate. Do not have your own purity police that say there is only one way we're doing things. It's a dangerous path.
I have one question that I'd like to close with here, which is you lay out in the book a study that I was unaware of, that only 23% of the gay men who were infected in the 1983-85 period, like yourself, remained alive by 2019, which means 77% of your cohort is gone.
Right.
You're about 15 years older than Larry was when we met him.
Yeah.
And he seemed like the gay elder then. So I'm guessing this makes you the pretty rare HIV positive gay elder. What keeps you going?
Well, the activism I'm doing today on HIV and COVID, there are only a couple of us old timers involved with Prep for All, which fights for a national HIV prevention program centered around pre-exposure prophylaxis PrEP. And that group was founded by mostly HIV negative young gay men, millennials, who were on PrEP and were fed up and furious that they kept that some of their friends kept seroconverting because they hadn't heard about PrEP or they couldn't access it, or their doctors hadn't told them about it, and they had that anger that fueled ACT UP. So I generally am not hanging out with lots of people my age when it comes to the activism. I'm hanging out with the next generation of AIDS activists, and they're extraordinary. The last chapter of this crisis, the last chapter of the glorious history of AIDS activism, is being written by the millennials around the world, and they are a far more diverse group than ACT UP ever was. They truly reflect the diversity of people affected by HIV around the world, and we're interconnected globally thanks to the internet. And it's extraordinary to be a part I get very juiced by it. I get very inspired by it. And I am pretty convinced that I will witness a vaccine for HIV and a cure, hopefully before 2030, and if not sooner. So, so yeah, that's why I'm doing it.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you from the bottom of our hearts here at Politics and Prose, Peter Staley, Garance, Franke-Ruta, and our audience out there, who I can genuinely tell are that next generation of people continuing this activism. Please make sure to follow the link in the chat to get your copy of Never Silent, Act Up, and My Life in Activism, to really read about this story from the author. Your patronage and dedication enable us to bring you this incredible programming. We wouldn't be able to host these events without the book sales to support them. So we hope you'll follow that link and also check out the rest of our events calendar. And from our shelves viewers, we truly hope everyone out there is staying safe, staying strong, and of course, staying well read. And for author Peter Staley, I hope well fed as you go on to dinner now. Again, our thanks to you and to Garance, Franke-Ruta, and from all of us at Politics and Prose, we wish you a good night. Have a good evening, everyone. Good evening.